When people think about the fall of Berlin in 1945, they usually picture ruins, broken buildings, burned streets, red flags rising over shattered stone. They see soldiers celebrating victory and civilians staring into nothing. But what history remembers visually is not always what hurt the most. Some of the most devastating consequences of war leave no photographs, no dramatic footage, no clear images to point at and say, this is where it happened. And yet, for hundreds of thousands of women in Germany, the war did not end when the guns fell silent. It changed shape. In April and May of 1945, Berlin collapsed in every possible sense, militarily, politically, socially. The Nazi regime imploded. The city was surrounded, starved, bombed, and finally taken. Authority vanished almost overnight. Police stations stopped functioning. Courts ceased to exist. Neighbors disappeared. Families were torn apart by death, flight, or surrender. Into that vacuum stepped the Soviet army. To many in the West, this moment has long been framed as liberation, and in a fundamental sense it was. The defeat of Nazi Germany ended a regime responsible for unprecedented crimes. That truth matters, and it cannot be erased. But liberation and suffering are not mutually exclusive. For civilians trapped inside the ruins, especially women, the collapse of order brought a new and terrifying uncertainty. Not because every soldier was cruel, not because every encounter was violent, but because, in the absence of restraint, power became personal, and personal power is unpredictable. There are almost no photographs of what happened next, not because it didn't occur, but because it happened mostly indoors, in stairwells, in basements, in dark apartments with broken doors, in places where cameras did not go and where no one wanted to look afterward. What we know comes from fragments, hospital records that suddenly show spikes in trauma cases, diaries written in private, never meant for publication, medical reports quietly noting infections, injuries, pregnancies without explanation, and testimonies recorded decades later when silence finally began to crack. For years after the war, many of these women said nothing, some out of fear, some out of shame, some because no one wanted to hear stories that complicated the simple narrative of victory and defeat. In post-war Germany, memory itself became a battlefield. In the East, criticizing the Soviet army was forbidden. In the West, acknowledging German civilian suffering felt morally dangerous, as if recognizing one trauma might excuse another. So the silence remained. What makes this history difficult is not only the violence itself, but the way it resists clean storytelling. There are no heroic arcs here, no satisfying resolutions, no clear villains that can be safely isolated from the broader reality of war. Only people. Women who survived one regime's collapse only to face lawlessness under another power. Women who learned quickly that survival did not always look like resistance. Sometimes it looked like adaptation, negotiation, invisibility. This is not a story about numbers alone. Estimates vary wildly, and statistics can blur the human cost into abstraction. This is a story about what happens when war strips away systems faster than it removes hatred. Before we talk about causes, accountability, and long-term consequences, one thing must be understood clearly. For many women in Germany, 1945 was not the moment the war ended. It was the moment when the rules disappeared. And when there are no rules, silence becomes a survival strategy.
By the time Soviet forces reached Berlin in late April 1945, the war was already lost for Germany. What remained was not resistance, but collapse. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Electricity failed. Water stopped running. Food supplies disappeared. Millions of civilians were displaced across Central and Eastern Europe, moving without maps, without certainty, and often without hope. Berlin alone had become a city of refugees, trapped inside their own ruins. In theory, the end of combat should have meant protection for civilians. In reality, it meant exposure. The Red Army that entered Germany was not a single uniform force. It was a vast mass of men drawn from across the Soviet Union. Soldiers who had survived years of brutal fighting, starvation, encirclement, and unimaginable losses. Many had seen their families killed, their villages burned, their homeland devastated by the Nazi invasion. That history shaped what came next. Soviet command formally prohibited violence against civilians. Orders were issued, decrees were written. In some units, discipline was enforced. Officers intervened, soldiers were punished. But orders collapse when systems collapse. Berlin was not simply occupied, it was overwhelmed. Units rotated rapidly, command structures shifted. Alcohol flowed freely from abandoned cellars. Millions of armed men moved through cities where no functioning civilian authority remained. For women, this created a terrifying equation: visibility plus vulnerability. Age offered no protection, social status offered no protection, political allegiance offered no protection. Teenagers, mothers, elderly women all appear in survivor testimonies. Some were assaulted once, many were assaulted repeatedly over days or weeks by different men. The violence was not always chaotic. Sometimes it was disturbingly routine. Women learned quickly which buildings were dangerous, which stairwells echoed footsteps at night, which doors could be barricaded and which could not. Some slept fully clothed, others hid in groups. Some deliberately sought out a single soldier, often an officer, believing that attaching themselves to one man might protect them from many. Survival became transactional. This is one of the hardest aspects of this history to confront, not because it reflects weakness, but because it exposes how war erodes moral categories. Choices made under coercion are later judged as if they were freely chosen. Many women carried that burden alone for the rest of their lives. Medical facilities in Berlin and Eastern Germany quietly filled with cases that doctors did not describe openly. Injuries were recorded without explanation. Pregnancies appeared without acknowledgement. Abortions, legal and illegal, increased sharply. Sexually transmitted infections spread rapidly. The records exist, but they are clinical, cold, detached. What they do not capture is the psychological devastation. Survivors describe a constant state of alert, listening for boots on stairs, memorizing escape routes through ruins, calculating when to run and when to freeze. For many, the most frightening moment was not the assault itself, but the anticipation, the knowledge that it could happen again at any time. And often, it did. This violence was not confined to Berlin. It occurred across Eastern Germany, in towns, villages, farms, and refugee columns on frozen roads. In some areas, it continued for months after the official surrender. Yet even as it unfolded, it was already being buried. Soviet authorities discouraged reporting. German institutions were in no position to investigate. Families avoided the topic. Communities prioritized rebuilding over remembering. In the emerging Cold War, the narrative hardened. One side liberated, the other was liberated from. There was no space for complexity. To acknowledge these crimes did not fit easily into the moral architecture of post-war Europe. Doing so risked equating victim and aggressor, or worse, appearing to soften the crimes of Nazism by highlighting German suffering. So the story remained fragmented. But fragment does not mean false.
When testimonies are compared across regions, decades, and political systems, the patterns align. Different women, unknown to each other, describe the same fear, the same strategies, the same silence afterwards. The war ended on paper in May 1945. For many women, it continued in private, long after flags were raised and victory was declared. And the most painful part was not only what happened, but the knowledge that history would struggle to find a place for it.
One of the most unsettling aspects of this history is not only what happened, but how little of it appears to exist. When viewers look for proof, they instinctively search for images, photographs, film reels, clear visual evidence that can anchor belief. In the case of Nazi crimes, such images exist in horrifying abundance. Camps were liberated with cameras present, mass graves were documented, evidence was gathered deliberately. With the violence against German women in 1945, the situation was different. There is no single iconic photograph, no moment frozen in time that defines the crime. This absence has often been misinterpreted as absence of the crime itself. In reality, it reflects the nature of how, where, and when the violence occurred. Most assaults took place away from public view, inside private apartments, in abandoned buildings, in cellars converted into shelters, in spaces where women hid precisely because they believed they were safer there. Cameras were rare, journalists were restricted. Soviet military photography focused on victory, heroism, and reconstruction, not civilian suffering caused by occupying troops. Even when foreign journalists entered Berlin later in 1945, the moment had already passed. What they saw were ruins, queues, hunger, and exhaustion. The violence had receded into memory, leaving behind no visible scars that could be easily photographed. The evidence that does exist is scattered and deeply uncomfortable. Hospitals in Berlin and surrounding regions recorded a sudden and dramatic increase in gynecological injuries, infections, and trauma-related conditions. Doctors noted symptoms without context. Diagnoses were written in coded language. Some medical staff later admitted that they avoided explicit descriptions to protect patients and themselves. In many cases, medical files were later destroyed, lost, or deliberately incomplete. Diaries provide another layer of evidence. These were not public documents, they were private attempts to make sense of chaos. Women wrote in fragments, sometimes switching to shorthand or euphemism. Some stopped writing altogether after certain entries. Others wrote obsessively, as if documenting events might give them control over them. What makes these diaries powerful is not dramatic language, but repetition. Different women in different parts of Germany, with no connection to one another, describe the same sequence of events, the same fear at night, the same calculations, the same realization that appealing to law or morality no longer worked. Post-war surveys, conducted quietly and often years later, revealed patterns that could not be dismissed as coincidence. In some districts, medical authorities estimated that a significant percentage of women had experienced sexual violence during the initial months of occupation. In Berlin alone, estimates ranged widely, but even the lowest figures pointed to mass victimization. Yet none of this translated into public reckoning. In the Soviet-controlled zone, discussing these events was politically dangerous. The official narrative framed the Red Army as heroic liberators. Acknowledging crimes committed by Soviet soldiers undermined that legitimacy. Women who spoke openly risked social consequences, surveillance, or worse. In the Western zones, the silence took a different form. Here, the issue was moral discomfort. Germany had initiated a war of annihilation. German soldiers had committed atrocities across Europe. To focus on German civilian suffering felt, to many, like a distortion of responsibility or even an attempt to reverse roles.
As a result, women were placed in an impossible position. If they spoke, they risked being accused of exaggeration, collaboration, or moral weakness. If they stayed silent, they carried the burden alone. For decades, this silence shaped families. Children sensed that something was wrong, but were never told what. Marriages were strained by unspoken trauma. Many women never used the word rape altogether, even in private. They referred to that time, or what happened after the Russians came, or simply fell quiet. Only in the late 20th century did historians begin to piece these fragments systematically. When archives opened and Cold War taboos weakened, researchers compared testimonies across borders and ideologies. What emerged was not a single narrative, but a pattern too consistent to ignore. Still, even today, this history makes people uneasy. It resists simplification. It does not fit neatly into categories of hero and villain. It forces uncomfortable questions about power, revenge, and the limits of moral clarity in total war. And perhaps that's why the lack of images matters so much. Without photographs, the burden of belief shifts to words, to records, to voices that were never amplified when it mattered most. The absence of visual proof does not weaken this history. It explains why it was so easy to look away.
To understand what unfolded in Germany in 1945, it is not enough to look only at the victims. The perpetrators must also be examined, not to excuse their actions, but to understand how such violence became possible on such a scale. The soldiers of the Red Army who entered Germany had come from a war unlike anything most armies in history had endured. From 1941 onward, the Eastern Front had become a war of annihilation. Entire Soviet villages were erased. Civilians were executed, starved, or deported. Millions died not as collateral damage, but as targets. Many Soviet soldiers reached Germany after years of fighting, in which mercy was rare and survival often required brutality. This experience shaped perception. German territory was not seen as neutral ground. It was seen as the source of suffering. German civilians were not always viewed as separate from the regime that had invaded the Soviet Union. Propaganda reinforced this idea, portraying Germans collectively as responsible for unimaginable crimes. Revenge in this environment was not abstract, it felt earned. But war does not distinguish between explanation and permission. Officially, Soviet leadership condemned violence against civilians. Orders were issued demanding discipline. Some commanders enforced them. Courts-martials occurred. Executions were carried out in extreme cases. These facts matter because they show that what happened was not state policy, and yet enforcement was inconsistent. The sheer scale of the Red Army made control difficult. Units were constantly moving. Officers were exhausted or overwhelmed. Alcohol was abundant. Civilian oversight was non-existent. In this environment, individual soldiers exercised power without accountability. What emerged was not a coordinated campaign, but a permissive chaos. Violence became normalized through repetition. A soldier who saw others commit abuses without consequence learned quickly that restraint was optional. Women became symbols, not individuals, onto which anger, loss, and entitlement were projected. For many soldiers, Germany was the first place where they felt victorious, dominant, and untouchable. That psychological shift mattered. But this explanation has limits. Atrocities experienced do not morally license atrocities committed. Millions of Soviet civilians suffered under Nazi occupation, and that suffering was real, vast, and documented. Acknowledging it is essential, but it does not erase responsibility for crimes committed afterward. This is where historical discussion is often fractured. Some narratives emphasize Soviet suffering so heavily that crimes in Germany appear inevitable, almost natural. Others
solely on German victimhood, stripping the context of its cause. Both approaches distort reality. The truth sits uncomfortably between them. The Red Army defeated a genocidal regime. That victory ended a war that had already killed tens of millions. Without it, the outcome of the 20th century would have been far darker. Yet, within that victory, crimes occurred. For the women who experienced violence, the distinction between liberation and occupation was meaningless at the moment. What mattered was the presence of armed men, the absence of protection, and the realization that survival required constant calculation. Some soldiers helped civilians, others shared food, some intervened to stop assaults. These acts existed, and survivors remember them. But isolated kindness did not counterbalance systemic vulnerability. What makes this period especially difficult to confront is that it exposes how moral frameworks collapse under extreme conditions. The same army could liberate camps and terrorize civilians. The same soldier could show compassion one day and commit violence the next. History prefers clean lines. This story has none. In the aftermath, political needs hardened these ambiguities into silence. The Soviet Union needed a heroic narrative. Germany needed to rebuild without reopening wounds that challenged moral hierarchies. Western powers needed unity against a new adversary. Women's experiences did not fit any of these needs, so they were set aside. Not erased entirely, but pushed to the margins, where personal memory survives without public acknowledgement. Understanding this does not mean accepting it. It means recognizing that mass violence rarely emerges from monsters alone. It emerges from institutions under strain, identities under siege, and moments when accountability dissolves faster than restraint. And when that happens, civilians, especially women, pay the price.
When violence becomes unpredictable and protection disappears, survival stops looking like resistance. It becomes adaptation. For many women in occupied Germany, especially in 1945 and the months that followed, survival was not heroic. It was practical, exhausting, and morally ambiguous. And that is precisely why it remains so difficult to talk about later. Women learned quickly that traditional ideas of safety no longer applied. Locked doors could be forced open, neighbors could not always be trusted. Appeals to law or authority meant nothing when authority itself had collapsed. So they improvised. Some hid for weeks at a time in cellars, attics, or bomb shelters long after the fighting ended. They moved only at night, avoided windows, and learned to remain silent for hours. Entire families lived in darkness, listening for footsteps above them. Others formed groups, believing that numbers offered protection. Women slept together, watched entrances, and rotated lookout duties. This helped sometimes, but not always. Groups could be discovered, shelters could be breached. A strategy that appears repeatedly in testimonies is one that many survivors found hardest to explain later: attaching oneself to a single soldier, often an officer, sometimes an older man, occasionally someone who showed restraint or offered food. The logic was simple and brutal. One man was safer than many. If a woman was claimed, she was less likely to be assaulted by others. This was not consent. It was coercion under threat. Yet, decades later, many women feared being judged as collaborators rather than recognized as survivors. The line between choice and survival blurred so completely that language itself failed them. Some women altered their appearance deliberately. They cut their hair short, they wore oversized clothing, they smeared dirt or soot on their faces. They tried to look older, sicker, invisible. Mothers disguised daughters as boys. Grandmothers kept children hidden beneath floorboards. None of these measures guaranteed safety. Medical consequences followed quickly.
Hospitals recorded waves of sexually transmitted infections. Gynecological wards were overwhelmed. Pregnancies appeared in a city already struggling with starvation. Legal abortion, briefly permitted by Soviet authorities under specific conditions, became one of the few forms of institutional acknowledgement that something was terribly wrong. But even here, silence dominated. Women were treated, procedures were performed, records were kept, clinically, quietly, without public discussion. Trauma was managed as a medical issue, not a moral or social one. The psychological toll was immense. Many survivors described a profound detachment from their own bodies, a sense that something fundamental had been taken, not violently in a single moment, but gradually through repetition and fear. Trust collapsed. Intimacy became fraught. Nightmares persisted for decades. Some women never married. Others did, but carried secrets that shaped their relationships in invisible ways. Children grew up sensing tension without understanding its source. Husbands often did not ask, not always out of cruelty, but because they feared the answers. Society reinforced this silence. In both East and West Germany, women were expected to rebuild, not to grieve. They cleared rubble, worked factories, fed families. The image of the resilient post-war woman left little room for vulnerability. Admitting trauma risked being seen as weak, damaged, or morally compromised. So many women adapted again. They compartmentalized. They buried memories beneath routine. They focused on survival in a new sense, economic, social, familial. The past became something to be endured privately, not processed publicly. What makes this period especially painful to examine is how completely survival erased recognition. These women did not receive medals. They were not included in victory narratives. Their suffering did not become part of official memory. Yet without them, post-war Germany could not have functioned. They rebuilt cities while carrying unacknowledged wounds. They raised children while suppressing terror they had never been allowed to name. They became the foundation of recovery while remaining excluded from its moral accounting. This is why later generations struggled to understand what happened. When trauma leaves no monuments and no language, it does not disappear. It embeds itself quietly into families, into silence, into behaviors that seem inexplicable decades later. Survival saved lives, but it came at a cost that history was slow to recognize and slower still to honor.
When the immediate chaos of 1945 began to fade, many outsiders assumed the danger had passed. The front lines had moved, governments were forming, rations were organized, trains ran again, cities, though shattered, were alive. But for countless women, the most difficult phase had only just begun. Trauma does not end when violence stops, it evolves. In the months and years following the occupation, many survivors struggled with symptoms that had no name at the time: anxiety, dissociation, insomnia, panic at sudden noises, an overwhelming fear of enclosed spaces or uniformed men. Some could not tolerate physical closeness. Others experienced numbness so complete that they felt detached from their own lives. Psychology in post-war Germany was not equipped to address this. The field itself was rebuilding, resources were scarce, and sexual violence, especially against German women, remained a subject few professionals were willing to confront openly. So trauma went untreated. Instead, it was absorbed into daily life. Women returned to work, they married, they raised children, they rebuilt homes from rubble. On the surface, they appeared functional, even resilient. Beneath that surface, many lived with constant tension, as if danger might return at any moment. For those who became pregnant as a result of assault, the aftermath was especially complex.
Some pregnancies ended in abortion, legal or otherwise. Some ended in miscarriage. Others resulted in births that women felt unable to speak about honestly, even to their own children. In some cases, babies were placed for adoption without explanation. In others, they were raised within families that never acknowledged the circumstances of their conception. These silences carried forward. Children sensed discomfort around certain questions. Family histories contained gaps that no one filled. Entire generations inherited emotional distances they could not explain. In East Germany, the state imposed its own version of memory. The official narrative emphasized anti-fascist victory and socialist rebuilding. The Red Army was presented as heroic and protective. Acknowledging crimes committed by Soviet soldiers threatened the legitimacy of that story. As a result, women who spoke privately risked social consequences. Many learned quickly that silence was safer. In West Germany, the challenge was moral positioning. The country was grappling with guilt for Nazi crimes, rebuilding international trust, and integrating millions of displaced people. Public discourse centered on responsibility, reconstruction, and reconciliation. There was little appetite for stories that complicated the moral map. German women who spoke of suffering risked being perceived as shifting blame, minimizing Nazi atrocities, or seeking sympathy they did not deserve. This perception was rarely stated outright, but it shaped conversations, institutions, and media choices. So, once again, silence prevailed. For decades, these experiences were transmitted only in fragments, and remark overheard, a warning given without explanation, a sudden emotional withdrawal triggered by something no one else noticed. Many women did not even conceptualize what had happened to them as a crime. Without language, experience remains raw and unresolved. Some blamed themselves. Others believed endurance was simply part of being alive during that time. Only in the late 20th century did this begin to change. As Cold War divisions softened and archives opened, historians revisited the final months of the war with new questions. Feminist scholarship challenged traditional war narratives that focused exclusively on battles and leaders. Oral history projects recorded testimonies that had never been solicited before. What emerged was not a single revelation, but a slow accumulation. The same patterns appeared again and again. Different regions, different political systems, different decades, yet the stories aligned. This alignment mattered. It transformed isolated memories into historical evidence. It reframed what had long been dismissed as individual misfortune into a structural failure of protection. And it forced a reconsideration of what the end of the war actually meant for civilians. Still, recognition came late. Many survivors did not live to see their experiences acknowledged publicly. Others remained unwilling to speak, even when invited. Silence had become part of their identity, not because they preferred it, but because it had once kept them safe. The cost of that silence is difficult to measure. It shaped families, it influenced social norms, it affected how vulnerability was treated, how authority was perceived, how trust was extended or withheld. It became part of the psychological landscape of post-war Germany, even as it remained largely invisible. The war ended in 1945, but for many women, its consequences unfolded across a lifetime. And understanding that truth requires moving beyond dates and declarations and recognizing that history does not end when treaties are signed. Sometimes it only changes form.
Silence is rarely accidental. When entire societies avoid a subject for decades, it is usually because remembering it threatens something larger: legitimacy, identity, or moral order.
The experiences of German women after 1945 did not disappear because they were unknown. They disappeared because they were inconvenient. In the aftermath of the war, Europe needed narratives that could stabilize a shattered continent. These narratives were political, moral, and strategic. Silence is rarely accidental. When entire societies avoid a subject for decades, it is usually because remembering it threatens something larger: legitimacy, identity, or moral order. The experiences of German women after 1945 did not disappear because they were unknown. They disappeared because they were inconvenient. In the aftermath of the war, Europe needed narratives that could stabilize a shattered continent. These narratives were political, moral, and strategic. They explained who had won, who had lost, who was guilty, and who was rebuilding. There was little room for ambiguity. In East Germany, the state constructed its legitimacy on a single foundation: anti-fascist victory. The Soviet Union was the liberator. The Red Army was heroic by definition. Any acknowledgement of crimes committed by Soviet soldiers threatened the moral authority of the socialist state itself. As a result, memory became regulated. School curricula excluded civilian suffering caused by Soviet troops. Media avoided the topic entirely. Archives remained sealed. Women who spoke openly risked social marginalization, professional consequences, or surveillance. Over time, many internalized the lesson: silence was not only safer, it was expected. This was not enforced only through fear. It was reinforced through repetition. Official ceremonies, public monuments, films, and literature that celebrated liberation while omitting its darker edges. Memory was shaped not just by repression, but by saturation, by telling one story so completely that alternatives faded. In West Germany, the mechanism was different, but the outcome was similar. Here, the central moral task was reckoning with Nazi crimes. This reckoning was necessary and overdue. Millions of victims demanded acknowledgement. Entire legal and educational systems were reorganized around responsibility and guilt. Within this framework, German suffering posed a problem. If German civilians were recognized as victims, would that blur the distinction between aggressor and victim? Would it create false equivalence? Would it offer an escape from accountability? These fears shaped public discourse. As a result, stories of sexual violence against German women were often met with discomfort, skepticism, or deflection. They were seen as distractions from the far greater crimes committed by the Nazi regime, crimes that demanded absolute moral clarity. But moral clarity has a cost. By insisting on a single hierarchy of suffering, post-war discourse unintentionally erased experiences that did not fit neatly into it. Women who had endured violence learned that their stories complicated the narrative and therefore were unwelcome. Even within families, this tension persisted. Men returned from the war carrying their own trauma, guilt, or defeat. Many were unwilling or unable to hear what women had endured in their absence. Asking questions risked confronting powerlessness, jealousy, or shame. Silence became mutual, though rarely discussed. Silence shaped generations. Children grew up in households where certain topics were avoided instinctively, where emotions appeared without explanation, where sudden fear or anger had no visible cause. Psychologists later describe this as transgenerational trauma, pain transmitted not through stories but through behavior. By the time historians began to address the issue seriously in the 1980s and 1990s, many survivors were elderly. Some welcomed the chance to speak. Others refused. Decades of suppression taught them that telling the truth did not lead to justice, only exposure. When testimonies were finally published, they sparked controversy. Some critics accused historians of revisionism. Others feared political misuse. In some cases, far-right groups attempted to weaponize civilian suffering to minimize Nazi crimes, reinforcing the very hesitation that had delayed recognition in the first place. This created a paradox. Acknowledging women's experiences was necessary for historical honesty, but risky in a political environment where history itself was contested. As a result, scholars moved cautiously, emphasizing context, rejecting false equivalents, and repeatedly clarifying that recognizing German civilian suffering did not diminish responsibility for Nazi atrocities. This caution was necessary, but it also revealed something deeper. Societies do not struggle to remember only because facts are unclear. They struggle because memory reshapes identity. To acknowledge these crimes fully required accepting that victory can coexist with wrongdoing, that liberation can contain violence, and that moral binaries collapse under scrutiny. These are uncomfortable truths. They challenge the idea that history can be neatly divided into good and evil, perpetrators and victims, heroes and villains. They force recognition that war corrodes everyone that touches it, though not equally, and not without responsibility. For decades, it was easier not to ask. It was easier to let silence harden into tradition, to let absence masquerade as resolution, to treat what was not spoken as what did not matter. But silence does not neutralize history. It delays it. And when it finally breaks, it does so not as a whisper, but as a reckoning, demanding that societies confront not only what they did, but what they chose not to see.
History often searches for balance, but balance is not the same as equivalence. To remember what happened to German women in 1945 is not to rewrite the Second World War. It is not to dilute responsibility. It is not to place victims and perpetrators on equal ground. It is to confront a truth that resists simplification, that even a just victory can contain injustice, and that moral clarity does not require moral blindness. The defeat of Nazi Germany ended a regime built on genocide, conquest, and systematic dehumanization. That fact is not negotiable. It remains one of the central moral foundations of modern history. Millions were saved because that regime fell. Millions more were freed from camps, forced labor, and annihilation. But the end of one atrocity did not immunize the world against others. In the ruins of Berlin and across Eastern Germany, women experienced a collapse not only of buildings and governments, but of protection itself. Their suffering did not come from ideology alone, but from lawlessness, power imbalance, and the brutal arithmetic of war when restraint dissolves faster than hatred. What makes this history especially difficult is that it denies easy conclusions. There is no single villain who can be isolated and condemned without remainder, no single policy that explains everything, no moment where justice arrives on schedule. Instead, there is a web of responsibility, individual, institutional, and cultural, stretched across a continent shattered by total war. For decades, the easiest response was silence. Silence protected political narratives. Silence protected fragile post-war identities. Silence protected societies from confronting contradictions they were not ready to face. But silence did not protect the women who lived with the consequences. Their trauma shaped families, communities, and generations. It influenced how trust was built or withheld,
how authority was perceived, how vulnerability was treated. Even when unspoken, it left fingerprints on everyday life, in fear passed down without explanation, in emotional distance mistaken for strength, in stories that stopped just before the truth. When historians finally began to listen seriously, they did not uncover a hidden conspiracy. They uncovered something more unsettling, a collective decision repeated across decades to prioritize coherence over completeness. Yet history is not healed by coherence alone. It is healed by honesty. Remembering these women does not require justifying the crimes of the past, nor does it require minimizing the crimes that came before them. It requires holding two truths at once: that Nazi Germany unleashed catastrophic violence across Europe, and that civilians within Germany later suffered crimes that were real, widespread, and long denied. This is not moral confusion. It is moral maturity. A history that can only acknowledge suffering on one side is not strong, it is fragile. A memory that collapses when complexity enters is not truth, it is mythology. The women who endured this did not ask to become symbols. Most did not want to be remembered at all. They wanted to survive, rebuild, and move forward in a world that offered little space for their pain. But history has an obligation they were denied: to see them clearly. Not as counters in political arguments, not as tools for revisionism, not as footnotes beneath larger crimes, but as human beings caught in the collapse of systems far beyond their control.